In desperate attempts to downplay the horrors of chattel slavery, people will often go so far as to say that the enslaved actually liked being slaves and that they were content. They will often cite the enslaved's compliance as evidence, but history has left out the many people who died seeking their freedom and were tortured in the process. Though there are many, here are 3 true accounts of what happened to those who dared to be free. Number 1. In 1836, a slave named Tice Davis escaped from his owner farm in Kentucky. He was pursued by a group of men, including his owner and a slave catcher named Edward Prigg. Davis managed to evade them for a time, but was eventually captured and brought back to Kentucky. Upon his return, Davis was publicly whipped and tortured as a punishment for his attempt to escape. He was tied to a post and whipped until he was covered in blood and his flesh was torn apart. Despite the brutality of the punishment, Davis refused to reveal the names of any individuals who had helped him to escape or any details of his journey. As a result, he was subjected to further torture, including having salt and hot peppers rubbed into his wounds. Eventually, he was left to die of his injuries and his body was disposed of in a shallow grave. Number 2. In 1855, a slave named John was owned by a man named James Irwin in Missouri. John was a skilled blacksmith, and as such, his owner valued him highly. However, John had a strong desire for freedom and decided to escape from his owner's plantation. John made his way to Illinois, where he met a group of abolitionists who helped him on his journey to the north, to freedom in Canada. However, while he was traveling through Illinois, he was recognized by a slave catcher named Anthony Anderson, who had been hired by Irwin to track him down. Anderson pursued John across the state, eventually catching up with him near the town of Galesburg. John was arrested and taken back to Missouri, where he was subjected to brutal punishment for his escape attempt. According to historical records, John was publicly whipped and then placed in a wooden cage where he was left exposed to the elements for several weeks. During this time, he was given minimum food and water and was forced to endure extreme heat and cold. As a result of the conditions he was kept in, John developed pneumonia and his health began to rapidly deteriorate. Despite the efforts of his fellow slaves to care for him, John eventually died of his injuries and was buried in an unmarked grave on the plantation. Number 3. Our third story is that of a slave named Patsy, who was owned by a man named Edwin Epps in Louisiana in the mid-1800s. Patsy was known for her exceptional skills in picking cotton and her beauty, which made her a target of Epps' perverse desires. Despite the fact that she was married to another slave on the plantation, Epps frequently forced himself upon her, subjecting her to repeated sexual assaults. In an attempt to escape the horrors of her life, Patsy began to seek out ways to leave the plantation. She would sneak away at night to visit nearby plantations in search of a way to gain her freedom. However, she was eventually caught by Epps, who flew into a violent rage and subjected her to horrific punishments. According to historical accounts, Epps ordered one of his overseers to tie Patsy to a post and whip her until she was bloody and nearly unconscious. He then had her stripped naked and forced to lie face down on the ground, where he proceeded to have her repeatedly whipped with a leather strap soaked in vinegar and salt. Despite her agonizing screams and pleas for mercy, Epps continued to whip her until her back was torn and bloody, and her skin hung from her body in strips. He then had her dipped in a solution of brine and salt to further torture her.